The Starside Prophecy by Tirri. Read by the author. Chapter 25. Corkscrew Lane. It was difficult to embrace my new life, but I tried. What I found most difficult once again was having to adjust to the unfamiliar habits and motivations of strangers. I had my own bedroom, which I retreated to frequently, and I felt somewhat protected there, but not necessarily secure. My bed was a single, but it was soft and I loved my blanket, a crocheted ensemble of various mauve yarns that reminded me of something or somewhere remote or bygone. I wasn't sure why. I could remember all my previous bed covers and was able to describe their texture and patterns and how they felt against my body, but this ever so familiar blanket was new to me. I liked to rub the corner while I sucked my thumb, a childhood habit I had not been able to overcome, a habit that mostly took place in secret. I was lying in bed one night when I realised I was not sleeping because my mind was consumed by thoughts of the past. I'd had a nice day baking with Auntie Joan, and the evening by the log fire watching a detective series had been pleasant, but I've seemed to be living in a previous moment. The images in my head were vivid, which struck me as odd, but I didn't otherwise make much of it. I was just the regular old me with a mind full of already played out disturbances. As an owl hooted from somewhere in the distance, I began to remember the moments in the past where my mind had somehow broken free, and I wished for these moments to happen again. But soon an old scene of Roy shouting at my brother intruded, and now I was reliving my reaction to it. This went on most of the night. Auntie Joan had given me a hot water bottle, and its cover matched the blanket. I loved it. Affixed to the wall above the bed was a brass plaque with Jesus' hands clasped on it. Auntie Joan had bought me a Bible, along with a bookmark depicting Jesus calming the water. If she had any intention of wanting to save my heathen soul, she had gathered the necessary props. Within a week of living at Dodonall's, I developed a very annoying obsessive-compulsive disorder that was difficult to break. The only phone in the house was in the living room, and every time I walked past it, I felt compelled to dial my mum's number with the receiver still down so I wouldn't actually get through. I somehow felt that this connected me to her. I wasn't able to walk from the living room to the kitchen without dialing 0306 3332, and I had to regulate my movements so no one would witness what I was doing. Sometimes I would dial my mother's number 20 or 30 times a day. This helped me feel in control. I also decided that if I walked on pavement cracks, this would in some way be harmful to me. I avoided walking on pavement cracks, unaware that my obsessive compulsion to do so was a symptom of my out-of-control mind. Uncle Jim was very attentive. He encouraged me to talk about my feelings, and I was thrilled that someone was actually interested in how I felt about things. We would sit outside together beside the rose gardens on a wooden bench, and Uncle Jim would hold my hand, stroking it as I talked and talked and talked. Auntie Joan once remarked, "Well, you certainly bring out the best in him, dear." I was so wrapped up in my new situation as the centre of someone else's attention that it took me a while to notice how distinct and often how nutty this household was. Auntie Joan was always in the kitchen, ironing or cooking or doing the dishes. I felt she was silently communing with God, and the smile she wore made me feel like whoever she was praying to was responding to her. Auntie Joan was always adamant that God had us all under his watch, which I think made her feel safe. I thought the notion of someone watching was more intrusive than anything, even creepy. Auntie Joan spent a lot of her time listening to choir music as well as Christian pop and tedious, slow-paced Radio 1 plays. The satisfaction she got from her daily routine was obvious, and she took her job as a housewife as seriously as if something critical was actually taking place. When she hung the laundry on the clothesline to dry, she made sure the pegs did not leave unnecessary indents in the garments. When she made the beds in the morning, she always made sure the covers were rolled back for an hour prior so the bed could air, and the plants growing in the flower beds were pruned with meticulous care. The way Auntie Joan applied her attention to her day-to-day duties was gracious and noble. Her life was mundane, but she respected what she did as if she had been bestowed with a great and mighty responsibility. She always seemed so grateful and enthusiastic just to be ironing with music playing that I once wondered whether her comportment was a tribute to the God she insisted had blessed her so profoundly. Tim's life, on the other hand, was in complete contrast to his mother's. Tim, who was about 5'2", overweight and with a double chin, dribbled a lot, aggravating the cold sores in the corners of his mouth. Auntie Joan applied Bonjela at night, which helped. Tim's left big toe pointed to 11 o'clock and his right big toe to 1 o'clock. Tim was not steady on his feet and looked down a lot when he walked, which meant he bumped into things too. Tim spent a lot of time listening to lorry drivers on his CB radio, all the time while munching on fatty snacks, followed by the predicament of having soiled his underwear. Tim's constitution was the opposite of cast iron, but this never held him back because Auntie Joan always helped him whenever he needed it, and for the rest of his life, Tim would need some kind of assistance. Tim's greatest pleasure by far was shopping from mail-order catalogues, and he was the world's greatest consumer. He was allowed to order an array of stuff he would never use or wear. The thrill for him was in the shopping, not the acquisition. Sometimes Tim and I would listen to music together in his bedroom, but I was always on guard because I did not want to deal with him making any more sexual advances. Becky had once told me that Tim had been accused of behaving inappropriately towards some underage girls who attended the same learning facility, but Uncle Jim had enough money and clout to make these delicate incidents, as she called them, disappear. My caution towards Tim limited the possibility of a deeper bond forming between us. I was 15 and he was 28, but Tim accepted this with grace, and so did I. At night, a pile of logs on the fire and the TV tuned to Tim's favourite station, I would sit in my appointed armchair and everyone else would sit in theirs. Auntie Joan encouraged a little small talk here and there, but Uncle Jim always avoided it. And Tim couldn't talk even if he wanted to. At the end of the evening, we would all traipse up the stairs and Tim and I would wait for Auntie Joan to come into his bedroom to conduct our prayer ritual. Tim and I were obliged to pray because Auntie Joan thought God required this. Her prayer, which she led and we followed in our minds, was not adventurous. It just petitioned for God to keep us all safe. Safe from what, I wondered? And why wouldn't he do so without praying for it night after night? The prayer went like this. In my bed I lie, Heavenly Father, hear my cry. Lord, protect me all the night. Keep me safe till morning light. God bless Mummy, God bless Daddy, God bless all the people I love, and help me to be good forever and ever. Amen. Tim held his mum's hand while she stooped to her knees beside him. I sat on the end of Tim's bed facing them. Tim mumbled noises from his throat to honour his mum's expectation that he was contributing his best effort. I quite liked the new prayer ritual and went along with it with a gusto that pleased Auntie Joan. Although she encouraged it, I did not pray for anything in particular because I wasn't as certain as she that anyone was even listening, and if they were, I wasn't sure they cared. I sometimes wonder whether Tim prayed for anything in particular. In his condition, I would have prayed for a voice to speak, but perhaps he did pray for that in a fashion, but no one heard, not that I could tell. It was at this time in my life that I made a valiant attempt to actually read the Bible. This also pleased Auntie Joan, and I wondered why. Was it because I was being obedient to her wishes, or because she thought God might approve of me more? The language in the Bible was obscure, and the content unfathomable, and the print was so unreasonably small that I couldn't make much headway, but I did learn Psalm 1 off by heart. I read it softly out loud over and over again, night after night. This mantra became another obsessive-compulsive ritual, and I never got to Psalm 2. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. Auntie Joan often spoke of the good Lord and his mercies. I would picture him in my head early on, but he looked a bit too much like my mum's third husband, so I stopped doing that. What does the good Lord look like? I asked her one day as she rolled pastry. I was peeling apples and I was getting very good at it, only taking off a uniform slither of skin. Auntie Joan wiped the flour off her hands and walked into the dining room to dig out a fat book stacked on the bottom shelf of the Welsh dresser. She leafed through it until she found a picture of Michelangelo's Creation of Adam. I thought he looked all right, very human. Uncle Jim just rolled his eyes in his head and left them there. Auntie Joan was so certain there was a God that for the first time in my life I began to consider whether there might be. But if there was a God, why had he created so many unhappy people? And why would I need his mercy to the extent that Auntie Joan thought I might? She knew I had doubts about the God she was unconditionally committed to, and this made her a little uncomfortable because for her, questioning the existence of God was taboo, if not blasphemous. She would have been much happier had I just believed and not asked such impertinent questions. Uncle Jim mostly just shuffled from his bedroom to the living room and to the kitchen and to the lavatory, changing the order when necessary, but that was the extent of his day. He had retired the year before at the age of 60 and was now mortally bored. To be understimulated was what he had retired for, but now his mind was in jeopardy of imploding. It was difficult for him to confront his boredom because material comfort was what he had spent 45 years striving for. Uncle Jim had very little to say to Auntie Joan, his responses to her queries pathetically minimal. His wife clearly irritated him, but I suspected the real reason he shunned her was out of some strain of jealousy. Auntie Joan was happy with her life and he was not. That had turned to spite. She would go about her day with a sunny smile and a resolve to be and remain cheerful. Uncle Jim was not as competent as his wife in this department and behaved like a resentful brat, but only behind closed doors. Out in the world, Uncle Jim was unrecognisable as the same man who moped about the house. He had a reputation as an accomplished man with a quick wit and saucy charm. Most of the villagers were intimidated by Jim Elks, which took the form of deferential respect. He was not, after all, some yokel farmer, but an entrepreneur who had designed and patented a piece of surveying equipment that was a sought-after instrument in the civil engineering field. Uncle Jim always displayed a jocular demeanour when visitors dropped by or when he bumped into local farmers at the country store, and he always behaved as if he was delighted to see whoever it was, no matter their social status or career accomplishments. Everyone was flattered. It was as if that person was the most significant person in the world at that moment. He had certainly made me feel that way when I first arrived. A month or two prior to my arrival, Uncle Jim had volunteered at the Citizens Advice Bureau, a free service for those who could not afford professional advice or legal counsel in the city of Yeovil. The word quickly got around that the Oracle had started up shop at the top of the high street. Uncle Jim offered sound and concrete advice regarding an assortment of legal and domestic problems with the assured demeanour of someone who was rarely wrong. The irony was that it was his marriage that was in need of oracular help. As a volunteer on Saturday mornings, Uncle Jim also drove a bus, a free public service for the elderly and infirm, dropping them off at the leisure centre and bringing them home again at the end of the day. I went with him a few times. The bus was retrofitted with a hydraulic system that allowed for wheelchair access. It was Uncle Jim's job to transport those on their last legs to their last bit of freedom before they wound up housebound. If you had asked anyone about Jim Elks, they would have said something like, "Oh, wonderful man, a real treasure." He engaged everyone with a cheery smile, told a few jokes and was a very good listener. Jim Elks was considered a pillar of the community, the attentive father of his handicapped son and the adoring husband of his cancer-surviving wife. But Jim Elks was actually an introvert, full of bitter thoughts that could only be kept at bay with enough Valium to lay out a cowl. Only his doctor, Auntie Joan, and now I knew the lengths he went to in order to sustain the pretence. Uncle Jim led a well-respected external existence, but within a few seconds of walking through the front door, he would clamber back into his shell. The sham of his outer world was so draining that he would flop into his armchair to recover from the meaningless marathon, only preserving enough energy to climb the stairs later that night for bed. Most evenings I would take Dina, Auntie Joan's Jack Russell Terrier, out for a walk. Corkscrew Lane, sandwiched between pasture lands with only chirping and moos and cock-a-doodle-doos to hear, was my favourite place to go. I seldom saw a car, but lots of pheasants and rabbits. One evening, Uncle Jim decided to join me. I was shocked but delighted. I linked my arm through his and we walked side by side peacefully. But this fatherly, daughterly stroll presented to me an event that indicated just how utterly naive I really was. Uncle Jim's arm was draped over my left shoulder as we passed farmyard gates and fields of sheep. I was talking earnestly about my feelings again and my frustrations when his hand slid down to my left breast. I stopped aghast and perplexed. Surely he must have a perfectly pure and rational explanation for what had just happened. But when I looked up at him, Uncle Jim had his mouth open and he was breathing heavily. His hand had not moved. I remained frozen, but only for a second, and then I skipped on ahead, holding Dina's leash tightly. Uncle Jim stayed close behind me. When I walked through the back door, Auntie Joan said, "Did you have a nice walk, dear?" She was as naive as I was. I vowed I would never tell her what happened on Corkscrew Lane. Besides, who wants to be told that after 40 years of marriage, the father of their 5 children fantasises about fucking a 15-year-old? She would have been devastated. Uncle Jim walked in a few moments later and did not look at me. After that, he avoided looking at me whenever he remembered. Uncle Jim was no longer interested in my feelings, and our little therapy chats ceased. I was very happy about that. I decided not to tell my mum about what had happened either, not because she would have been devastated, but because she wouldn't have done anything to help me, and I would have been devastated.